A small Saheli nation absorbed an airport attack and exposed a continental fault line in days. Condemnation arrived quickly, accountability did not, and the gap between words and action widened under pressure across the region. What does this mean for you when Ibrahim Traoré eyes solidarity to naming sponsors, consequences, and measurable follow-through rather than ritual statements? Because what unfolded next quietly reshaped expectations about leadership, sovereignty, and who is willing to carry the cost. You are about to hear an account that carries weight precisely because it moves past ritual language and into consequences. You will gain a clearer map of responsibility, timelines, and leverage that most coverage avoids. This is not information for casual listening. If you stop here, it becomes easy to mistake condemnation for protection and statements for strategy. It becomes easy to accept half answers that feel reassuring but change nothing on the ground. It also becomes easy to miss how institutional habits shape real outcomes for security, trust, and regional stability. By staying, you'll see how a single response can reveal structural limits, competing visions of solidarity, and the cost of avoiding uncomfortable questions. You will understand why naming, process, and follow-through matter more than tone, and how that difference alters expectations for leadership across the Sahel. Missing this means carrying a simplified story forward, one that blurs responsibility and dulls accountability. Not by amplifying outrage, but by tracing how decisions travel from statements to consequences. The first clarification is uncomfortable but necessary. While the dispute itself centered on responsibility and sponsorship, and those are not the same thing, that gap matters because it determines whether an institution is positioned to deter repetition or merely to comment after the fact. The attack occurred within a narrow overnight window at a major airport, yet the official reaction cycle stretched beyond the moment when attribution and inquiry would have had the greatest preventive value. The context did not begin with that night. It grew from a longer pattern in which security incidents across the Sahel are met with standardized language that affirms principles but avoids procedural escalation. Over time, this habit trained expectations. States learned what would follow an attack and, just as importantly, what would not. In this case, national authorities pointed outward, naming alleged sponsors and calling for verification. The Continental statement stopped earlier, choosing moral censure without an investigative trigger. That choice transformed a security incident into a test of institutional credibility. Why did it escalate so quickly in perception? Because two visions collided. One treats solidarity as consensus language that preserves unity by minimizing friction. The other treats solidarity as a willingness to test claims publicly, even when that risks internal conflict. Ibrahim Traoré aligned with the second vision, arguing that deterrence requires naming, inquiry, and consequences, not only expressions of sympathy. The disagreement was therefore not about tone, but about mechanism. The first groups affected were not abstract institutions but frontline communities and security services who measure protection by outcomes. For them, the question was practical: does this process reduce the chance of recurrence? Businesses operating near transport hubs watched signals closely, reading the response as a forecast of stability or exposure. Diplomats across the region read the divergence as an indicator of which framework might dominate future crises. This is the moment where curiosity resolves into stakes. If condemnation substitutes for inquiry, accountability thins. If inquiry proceeds, even amid disagreement, deterrence strengthens. The episode revealed that the choice between those paths is no longer theoretical. It is being made in real time, with real consequences, and with leaders like Ibrahim Traoré pressing the issue from the center of the debate. At this point, a guide emerged to help read the map rather than react to the noise. It was not a distant commentator, but a leadership position speaking from inside the pressure of events. Interpreting what the institutional response signaled and what it withheld, the value of that guidance lay in proximity. It came from someone measuring security not by headlines, but by whether procedures would change after the statement faded. A first early impact appeared in how claims were handled. Instead of treating allegations as rhetoric to be dismissed or absorbed, the guide perspective reframed them as inputs that require process. Test them and accept the result, whichever direction it points. That insistence shifted the discussion from emotion to procedure. It also clarified why silence felt consequential without an inquiry path. The system defaults to repetition. A second early impact followed quickly. By contrasting two responses side by side, one emphasizing moral language and the other emphasizing attribution and verification, the guide perspective exposed a pattern rather than a one-off. Similar incidents had produced similar statements before, with similar outcomes. Seeing that pattern made it harder to argue that this was merely an isolated lapse. It suggested a structural preference for stability of language over stability of security. For observers across the region, this guidance mattered because it reduced ambiguity. It showed how to interpret future statements, what to expect from them, and where their limits likely sit. It also explained why the disagreement drew attention so fast. It was not personal, and it was not theatrical. It was about whether institutions are willing to move from principle to procedure when pressure mounts. From that moment, the story crossed a threshold. It was no longer just about an attack or a communique. It became about whether established mechanisms could adapt when confronted with explicit claims and rising expectations, or whether alternative models of leadership would continue to gain traction. From here on, the sequence accelerates, and the consequences become harder to contain. It began with a narrow trigger that broke routine. Overnight, a transport hub was struck, and by morning the first reactions were already circulating. Initial condemnations arrived fast, predictable in form, and familiar in tone. Attribution was deferred, process was not announced. The moment when momentum could have been redirected quietly passed. Pressure built in hours, not days. National authorities moved first, naming alleged sponsors and framing the incident as part of a wider pattern rather than an isolated breach. What had been a security update became a political test. Statements multiplied, briefings hardened. The escalation phase compressed quickly. Regional actors weighed in, some urging restraint, others urging clarity. Markets near transport corridors reacted cautiously. Security services adjusted posture without waiting for guidance. Each step fed the next. Sharper claims demanded response. Response arrived unevenly, deepening the split. Then came the inflection. A contrasting statement rejected ambiguity and endorsed attribution as a prerequisite for solidarity. It named, it aligned, and it accepted the risk of friction. Ibrahim Traoré stood on that line, signaling that unity without procedure is brittle. The effect was immediate. Supporters saw deterrence. Critics saw escalation. Neutral observers saw a new threshold crossed. Aftershocks followed. Institutional credibility became the subtext of every exchange. Diplomatic channels worked overtime to contain spillover. Businesses recalculated exposure. Frontline communities measured protection by actions taken, not language issued. What could not be undone was the precedent. Future incidents would be read through this sequence. By the end of the cycle, the residue was clear. Nothing returned to baseline. Expectations changed. A path that avoids naming now looked like a choice, not a necessity. A path that embraces inquiry now carried visible costs, but also visible leverage. The timeline closed with a simple fact: once process becomes part of the story, speed matters, silence is consequential, and leadership is judged by what it is willing to test publicly. This is where emotion gives way to weight. Before numbers appear, the frame has to tighten, because this is the point where claims either hold or collapse. But scale, speed, and human exposure, the three signals that tell whether a crisis is contained or compounding. The first anchor is scale. A single overnight attack at a major airport is not just a local disruption and civilian movement in one node. When that node is hit, the impact radiates outward through supply chains, security postures, and confidence. Even without casualty figures, the choice of target alone signals intent to amplify consequences beyond the immediate sight. The second anchor is speed. The interval between the incident and the first institutional response was measured in hours, but the interval between that response and any announced investigative mechanism stretched longer. In security terms, delay increases uncertainty, and uncertainty invites repetition. The difference between reacting quickly and reacting procedurally is not cosmetic, it changes incentives on the ground. The third anchor is human exposure. Transport hubs touch civilians, workers, traders, and travelers simultaneously. When such a site is attacked, the number of people indirectly affected multiplies fast, far beyond those present at the moment of impact. Routes are rerouted, jobs pause, families adjust plans, even without public tallies. The lived disruption becomes a measurable burden across days and weeks. Taken together, these anchors explain why the response drew scrutiny. A large-scale node was struck. The tempo of escalation was fast. The human footprint was wide. Against that backdrop, condemnation without inquiry feels light. Not because condemnation is wrong, but because it does not match the weight of the event. This is why leaders like Ibrahim Traoré emphasize baseline versus change before the attack. Expectations were already fragile after it. The cost of procedural delay became visible. The evidence here does not shout. Scale expands the stakes. Speed compresses decision windows. Human exposure grounds the analysis in daily life. They force a harder question about whether institutions are built to absorb shock or to deflect responsibility. That question now sits at the center of the debate, unresolved but unavoidable. It holds that continental institutions must prioritize unity over accusation, especially in moments of shock. From this view, naming alleged sponsors too quickly risks fragmenting already fragile cooperation, escalating disputes before evidence is vetted, and turning security crises into political theater. Caution, proponents argue, is not cowardice but restraint, a way to prevent retaliation spirals and preserve channels for quiet diplomacy. That position gains force when considering the diversity of member states and the uneven capacity to investigate cross-border claims. An institution that speaks for many may feel obligated to limit itself to principles precisely because procedures vary. Evidence standards differ, and public accusations can outpace verification. Buying time for behind-the-scenes work that does not inflame publics or markets. Stability of language, then, is seen as a stabilizing force. A second counter-argument follows closely. It warns that public attribution without a shared investigative framework can backfire. If claims harden prematurely, mediation space collapses. Advocates of this view argue that institutions exist to lower temperature, not raise it. And that restraint keeps doors open when facts are contested and emotions run high. Both arguments are coherent, and both explain why institutions default to familiar phrasing, yet they leave something unaddressed. Delay without a visible path to verification does not remain neutral. It ends a signal of its own. In environments where attacks recur, actors learn what responses follow which actions. When condemnation arrives reliably but inquiry does not, incentives adjust accordingly. What was meant as restraint can be read as tolerance. This is where the balance shifts. The question is not whether unity matters, but whether unity without procedure deters harm. Ibrahim Traoré's position presses on that theme. It does not reject caution, it insists that caution be paired with a testable process. Without that pairing, restraint risks becoming predictability, and predictability weakens deterrence. Placing both views side by side clarifies the trade-off. One prioritizes cohesion through language. The other prioritizes prevention through procedure. The debate is not about who is louder, but about which approach better protects people over time. Understanding that distinction is what allows the analysis to move forward without caricature or denial. What changed the trajectory was not another statement, but the recognition that procedure itself had become the battleground. Once attribution was publicly endorsed as a condition for solidarity, the debate moved from what happened to how institutions respond when accusations are explicit. That shift matters because it redefines legitimacy. Legitimacy is no longer granted by tone or consensus alone, but by the willingness to test claims openly. The reveal sits here. The disagreement was never primarily about the attack. It was about whether continental mechanisms are designed to absorb pressure or to avoid it. By aligning with attribution and inquiry, Ibrahim Traoré effectively reframed leadership as exposure to risk rather than insulation from it. Even those who prefer ambiguity. The immediate effect was a reset of attention. Observers stopped counting statements and started tracking processes. Questions changed. Was an inquiry announced? Were claims acknowledged? Was there a timeline? Silence began to read as a decision rather than a pause. In that sense, the midpoint reveal is procedural, not dramatic, but its impact is sharper than rhetoric. From here, the story opens into consequences. If procedure advances, incentives shift. If it stalls, repetition becomes more likely. Either way, the surface narrative of unity versus division gives way to a deeper layer about how authority is earned under pressure. Everything that follows traces back to this turn, when naming, testing, and accepting outcomes replaced comfort as the metric of leadership. From that turn, consequences stopped being abstract and became visible across daily life. What had been debated in statements began to register in decisions, budgets, and behavior. The effects spread unevenly, but they spread fast. For the state, the immediate pressure was procedural. Once attribution entered the conversation, authorities faced a choice between advancing verification or absorbing the reputational cost of delay. Moving forward risked diplomatic friction, standing still risked signaling incapacity. The result was a tighter decision window and higher scrutiny of every subsequent move, because credibility now depended on follow-through rather than phrasing. For businesses, especially those linked to transport and logistics, uncertainty translated into caution. Insurance terms were revisited. Investment committees asked whether exposure was temporary or structural. Even small delays compounded costs, not because operations stopped entirely, but because confidence thinned. Markets respond to signals, and the signal they read was not the attack alone, but how decisively institutions responded to it. For people on the ground, the impact was felt in routines. Travel plans changed. Security checks multiplied. The disruption did not need large numbers to be real. It showed up as time lost, stress gained, and a sense that protection depends on decisions taken far from daily life. This is where the debate about procedure becomes personal, because delay is experienced as vulnerability. At the regional level, the divergence in responses widened fault lines. Neighbors recalculated alliances. Observers compared models of solidarity. The question shifted from who condemned fastest to who was willing to carry the costs of inquiry. Ibrahim Traoré's stance sharpened that comparison by tying solidarity to accountability, not just alignment. That made the issue larger than one incident. It became a reference point for future crises. The combined effect is cumulative. States feel pressure to choose clarity or comfort. Businesses price risk more conservatively. Regionally, norms begin to tilt toward whichever model proves more protective over time. The key insight is simple, but heavy consequences do not wait for conclusions. They accrue while institutions decide whether to test claims or move on. Once that reality is visible, no actor remains untouched. But managed tension. Statements continue, some procedural steps appear, and inquiry advances slowly without full transparency. Friction remains contained, but uncertainty lingers. Security posture stays elevated, investment hesitates rather than flees. And institutions operate in a narrowed lane where stability is preserved at the cost of speed. This is the outcome that feels familiar, workable, and incomplete. A more optimistic path is possible if procedure becomes visible and time-bound. Clear acknowledgement of claims, a defined verification process, and communicated milestones begin to change incentives. Diplomatic costs rise briefly, then ease as predictability returns. Confidence improves not because risks vanish, but because responses become legible. In this scenario, leadership gains credibility by accepting scrutiny, and the region benefits from deterrence that is earned, not assumed. The worst case emerges if ambiguity hardens into habit. Condemnation substitutes permanently for inquiry, accusations escalate outside institutions, and parallel narratives compete without arbitration. Markets price in chronic risk. Communities normalize disruption. Each incident raises the temperature because no mechanism absorbs the shock. This path erodes trust in shared frameworks and pushes actors toward unilateral measures. The practical guidance is steady. Do not bet on one scenario. Prepare for all three. Track where the claims are acknowledged, where the timelines are published, and where the outcomes are accepted. They indicate whether leadership is choosing comfort or protection, and whether institutions are adapting under pressure. In moments like this, foresight is not prediction, it is readiness grounded in how processes actually move. After following the arc from trigger to consequence and then to possible futures, the question shifts closer to home. What does this actually mean for you, sitting on the other side of the screen, trying to make sense of events that feel distant but keep intruding into daily life? If you are someone who actively follows regional affairs, the implication is double-edged. You have an informational advantage because you recognize patterns early. But that advantage only holds if you stay disciplined. Fast-moving situations reward attention to signals, not noise. Not just how they speak becomes your real edge. If you are affected indirectly, through work, prices, travel, or general uncertainty, the impact is quieter but persistent. These events shape the background conditions you plan against. They influence job security, business confidence, and the cost of simply moving people and goods. You may not control the decisions being made, but you can adjust expectations and reduce surprise by understanding why volatility appears when process stalls. If you have mostly felt that this does not concern you, that distance is understandable. But fragile. Moments like this redraw the boundary between local and regional. When institutional habits change, the effects travel outward. Being unprepared does not stop those effects, it only delays recognition of them. Across all three positions, the common thread is agency. You may not shape outcomes directly, but understanding how leadership choices, including those associated with figures like Ibrahim Traoré, alter incentives allows you to respond rather than react. Awareness does not eliminate risk, but it reduces helplessness. It turns uncertainty into something you can track instead of something that simply arrives. Solutions cannot remain slogans, because slogans do not interrupt patterns. What matters here is a route from intent to execution that makes responsibility visible and progress measurable. The transition begins by admitting that condemnation alone does not change incentives, and then deciding what replaces it. At the central level, leadership has to formalize process. That means acknowledging claims publicly, defining a verification mechanism, and setting a clear time frame for preliminary findings. Success is not measured by agreement, but by completion. Did the inquiry start? Did it report? Were its outcomes accepted or challenged with evidence? This is the minimum threshold for restoring deterrence. For institutions and organizations that operate around security and transport, the task is adaptation. Contingency planning must assume delays in political resolution and focus on resilience. Communication and coordination reduce the secondary damage of uncertainty. Effectiveness is measured by continuity, fewer disruptions, and faster recovery after shocks. At the community and individual level, action looks smaller but is no less real. Staying informed through credible signals, adjusting plans with flexibility, and resisting rumor-driven reactions all matter. Measurement here is behavioral. More preparedness, a clearer sense of what changes require action and what changes do not. A broader step can reinforce the first three. Even among a smaller group of willing actors can pilot inquiry models that others later adopt. Education and transparent communication amplify trust by explaining not just what decisions are made, but how. Over time, these layers reinforce each other. The closing point is simple and demanding. Solutions only count when they move from paper to practice. Leadership is tested not by how forcefully it speaks, but by whether it builds processes that survive pressure. In this moment, the difference between rhetoric and execution is the difference between recurring shock and gradual stability. The image that returns here is the one that first clarified the map, when leadership chose exposure over insulation and accepted that procedure would be tested in public. That choice still echoes, because it framed the entire journey you have just followed. From a single night of violence to a regional debate about credibility and protection. Seen end to end, the path is stark. What began as an attack became a mirror held up to institutions, revealing what they do under pressure and what they avoid. Along that path, expectations shifted. Familiar language lost its calming effect. Process, once invisible, became the measure of seriousness. Figures such as Ibrahim Traoré did not simply react to events, but forced a question about what leadership demands when comfort and accountability diverge. The meaning of the story sits here. It is not only about security or diplomacy, but about choice, whether to name and test claims or to smooth them over, whether to accept short-term friction for long-term deterrence, or to trade clarity for quiet. These are not abstract dilemmas. They shape how safe people feel, how businesses plan, and how regions imagine their future. The emotional weight comes from realizing that none of this is distant. Decisions taken in conference rooms ripple outward into routines, confidence, and risk. Once you see that connection, it is hard to unsee it. And the line that remains is this: when pressure rises, leadership is defined less by reassurance than by what it is willing to confront. If you stayed to the end, it means this was more than a passing update. It became a shared moment of attention where different views could sit in the same frame without being flattened or rushed. Not everyone will take the same meaning from it, and that is exactly why the conversation matters. If you think this perspective helps others see the stakes more clearly, consider passing it along so they can weigh it for themselves. Not to persuade, but to widen the circle of people thinking seriously about how institutions respond when pressure is real and time is short. Shared understanding is not agreement, but it is a starting point. What matters next is dialogue. Honest and grounded in how decisions translate into consequences. If you want to take part, reflect on one question and let it guide your response. When accountability is uncomfortable, what should matter more, preserving harmony today or building protection for tomorrow?